Hello, Andrea. Good to see you. How are you today?
I'm all right, thank you, Russell. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for joining us. It's great to talk to you. I thought I'd start by asking, how did you get into the field of ecclesiastical law? Where did the interest come from?
Yeah, so I did a law degree. So at King's London, which is where I met Mark Hill, our worshipful chairman. And so it was fun to bump into him years later. So I suppose that's where an interest in law and what its role within us as community and society comes from. So I practiced as a solicitor, I taught law, and then in my mid-30s went back to university and did a theology degree. And thanks to my one of my supervisors, Alan Ford, I bumped into Richard Hooker. And for those who don't know him that well, so he wrote the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which you have to admit is probably not the snappiest title that anybody's ever created, and sort of works against me a bit. But the first time I read Hooker, I was fascinated with his use of law, the way that for him, law is not about how to do something or how to run something or getting told off or whatever it might be, but is caught up with this whole vision of law as how do you participate in the divine life? How does God speak to us? How do we become full human beings in the presence of God? And that, I suppose, started that bit off and took me through to a PhD. So that was all rumbling around, if you like. And I'm guessing from the background I'm from, that was always going to resonate. Mm-hmm. And then I started teaching in theological colleges. And when I came to Queen's about just over 5 years ago, I was teaching Anglican identity. And although Canon Law often comes up for colleges in that bit where you just about to leave, or it's come up vaguely before, I started to think about what it might say to us about the nature of what it means to be Anglican, and particularly Church of England. And so started to weave that into my teaching, both drawing upon Hooker, but also drawing upon current Anglican identity, which I think also Hooker has got something to say about, not to do with Canon Law. And so at the moment it sits within a couple of lectures that look at obedience, loyalty and discipline, where we look at Canon Law, 39 articles and the professional guidelines. So that's how that sort of initially came up.
Great, wonderful. That's really fascinating to hear, and the academic interest in Richard Hooker, who, as you say, covers so many areas of Anglican identity, as we call it now, and law, both ecclesiastical law and all sorts of law.
Yeah.
For the Ecclesiastical Law Society, what would you say? Are there any particular insights that Richard Hooker brings to that we should have in mind when we study ecclesiastical law today?
I think, and again, I think this is what I try to bring out in the canon law stuff. So rather than starting from the list of do's and don'ts, I look at what I think of the theological underpinnings of this. And I suppose that weaves in with what I see as Hooker's understanding of what it means to be Church of England. So I think it's very much a covenantal relationship with each other, that we are a people of promise. We are a people who are responding to God's promise to us, but also we make promises with each other in the light of that baptismal vocation, I suppose. And therefore, I think Hooker's understanding of being Church of England is gracious. It's able to see God at work outside of the Church of England. It's almost recklessly gracious at times. So I think that particularly when we're thinking about what does it mean to be church, the wider church, but also what does it mean to be us as distinctively Anglican and distinctively Church of England, that's something about that graciousness and that openness and that ability to live by promise, I think.
Oh, no,
Did I answer your question, or did I just get myself into some excitement there?
no,
Sorry.
it did. I mean, it is exciting, isn't it? And you and I, of course, are in one of the Canons of the Church of England reading groups. And I think what's really interesting about that is, just as you say, with that approach to Hooker, is that we try and talk a bit about the theology underpinning the canon.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I find really interesting about the group is the combination of lawyers and clergy and theologians that's really the charism of our society, and we have all these different angles that we come to. Now that's really interesting.
There's something in Hooker about diversity, isn't there? About how we disagree well. And that seems to me to underpin again the role of accountability in canon law, which I'm guessing you want to talk about in a minute. But yeah, so I think all of those bits together, I mean, you have to chuckle. I've told everybody that I'm part of the canon law reading group, to which their response is usually, is this just because you can't get out, Andrea? So, I was like, excuse me, it's the highlight of my fortnight. The students think it's hilarious.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the students, and it's really interesting that you teach the canons at Queen's to students, to ordinands. How do you go about that? How is it all structured, and how does it work?
Well, it's a bit like I also teach doctrine, and you come across the same resistances, which is why is this relevant? And my goodness, this is going to be dull. They're the two things that you come up against initially. So I sort of have to approach this in a way that explodes both those myths. And I think increasingly people aren't very aware that there are canons. So some people will have been church wardens and members of PCC before they come through ordination, but many aren't. And increasingly, many aren't cradle Anglicans. I wasn't. So you have to come at this idea about, I suppose it's a bit like Hooker's title, you sort of have to take this apart a bit. So I start from that idea of promise, of accountability to each other, and about learning how we live well together. And we look at different ideas of what law can mean, and we play about with all those ideas to begin with. And then when we've laid those, if you like, theological ground rules, or more the fact of painting a different picture and horizon, we can then start to look at canon law together. So I sort of show it as being the result of our desire to live well and our desire to be accountable to each other. So putting it particularly against the backdrop of the current abuse inquiries in the Church of England and other bits that are going on amongst us, and what does it mean to be, and this is obviously particularly for ordinands. Sure. So I start from there, and when I feel like we're sort of getting a feel for this, then we look at particular canons that I think are relevant to them, that not simply about how do I run this, but how will I be? What will this bring about? So, for example, I usually start with something like, what can I wear? And morning and evening prayer, and something about church wardens. So I choose those partly because they're eye-openers for people. So students now get an idea that well, some of them will never have been aware that you had to wear certain things for church services, and some of them are very aware, and some of them now say, well, you can do what you like now. So we get the canon out together, and we look about that idea that this has to be agreed with PCC. And we start to wonder whether that is about challenging this view of us as a church that is hierarchical and top-down. So that these things are community, so that when we go in as an ordained person into a community, we don't go in with this, now you'll do as I say. So I teach this in a way that says, ordination invites us into a place to remind each other that it's not all about me.
I really think that canon law is so much about that. It's what, as you've
my
been saying,
word,
isn't it?
Absolutely. And then it becomes really exciting, because then it becomes, So what are you going to do if what you want to wear isn't what they want you to wear? How are you going to work that through together? Because these relationships are going to matter. So we do that. And then we look at morning and evening prayer, and we look at that again. And I've done some stuff on this for Ecclesiastical Law Society, so I won't go into too much, but about how that could be missional. And this is not simply about, I do tell them to go and buy a bell so they can ring, even if they're in their study, just because it's fun. But what does that mean? And why is that canon there? Because it's drawing us together. So you don't have to believe in George Herbert to do this. And then I think lastly, the thing about church wardens I use because, and again, I've done some stuff for ELS on this, is because it reminds us that we're not the only people with vocations. The way the canon is structured over church wardens, I think, if we took that seriously, could reshape the whole idea of what we think about vocation and being in ministry together. And it is so exciting, and it's all about character. It's not about, can you mend the roof?
Yeah.
So that's where I go from. So they start to have a feel, so that then you would hope that what happens in IME2 picks up on that. So, you know, the way that Simon and I do this for Lichfield is that Simon then comes in and talks about graveyards as soon as they get into curacy. But I want to start with some theological principles, I think.
Sure. No, that's great. Now, I think one of the fortuitous ways in which ecclesiastical law is organised is that for students and clergy, we've got this one source of law that's only, I suppose, a very small part of it, the canons, but it's a really good place to begin, isn't it? Because it's all together in one place. It's got a lot of those issues that are of immediate interest to clergy and PCC members and church wardens.
And I think that helps then to, as you say, it's just a small part, but I'm never, you know, and I talk a bit about the history and I talk a bit about various measures and things, but that almost immediately becomes overwhelming. If you can't work out why you would be following this in the first place. And of course, one of their arguments and questions is, but what happens if we break this? And of course, the answer is very little, unless this is part of a clergy discipline measure, which brings this as part of it. But I ask them then whether that's a good question to ask. So is this only good because it can be punished if you don't do it? And and actually is the lack of punishment, if you like, is that something that makes us take this more, not less seriously? And of course, we spend quite a lot of time looking at absolution and the whole idea. And again, that's quite difficult. And we spend a lot of time looking at that together and looking at that in relation to safeguarding issues, and that they all think that the seal of the confessional is only Catholic, Roman Catholic. And so there's quite a lot of work to do around that is pastoral as well. And seeing what we're coming up against, the breadth of our own denomination in all its richness and its challenge, I think.
Sure. So you said a lot of the students, there's a bit of trepidation before they start learning about the canons with you, Andrea. And how do they find it during and by the end? Are they asking for more?
You'd have to ask them. I've offered to do a bunting for them, you know, with different canon on, or the 39 articles. It's interesting that they have to, as part of their self-assessment at the end of the year, they have to talk about you know, what they might have found that's new or interesting, and it always comes up. So this idea that actually sometimes because they really don't like what they're reading and they're wondering how they're going to work with integrity. I mean, I shouldn't say this online, but we say to them, you are going to break canon law. You'll break it accidentally. You'll probably break it because you mean to break it. You just need to know why, and are you willing to be accountable for that? And what will you do if it really does go against everything in you? You know, where is the edge of loyalty and obedience? So we're realistic about this, and ask them to think about this before some of these things happen. It's a bit like, I always think, when you've got a wedding couple and you ask them what they're going to do the first time they have a massive argument. You know, And, you know, working as a solicitor, doing partnership agreements between people, if we think now about the tricky things that are going to come, at least we feel like you've got a head start. So I think it's an eye-opener for some. I ask them to gently take it into curacy and perhaps ask their TIs in supervision what they think about particular canons, and, you know, just say that they use me as an excuse. So I don't know. I think it's interesting.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, you can only give a snapshot.
Of course, no, I mean, it sounds really, really interesting. So a lot of people in the society, a lot of people watching this might have some involvement in teaching canons, teaching ecclesiastical law in all sorts of different contexts. Do you have any advice from your experience, any tips?
Keep it real, I think. Use the canons that feel like they have the most impact or the most rootedness in the people that you're speaking to. So it was fascinating. I did a day for Oxford Diocese on church warden training and looked at that, and then did some workshops, the various workshops, and I thought we'd be talking about some of the things I'd said. In actual fact, church wardens wanted to talk about this is really interesting, thinking this is a vocation, because they hadn't thought about it in that way. And the things that they were struggling with, like, how do I worship when I'm keeping my eye on the door, I'm keeping my eye on the drip that's coming from the, you know, the all those sort of things, and talking about their very presence as worship, because that linked to the idea of vocation. So I think spending time listening and responding to where people are, I think. I don't know if that, and make it real. I think ask them about, I'm guessing people who teach this already are doing this, so I feel like I'm telling my grandmother how to suck eggs. But, yeah.
No, I think that is really interesting. That's the great thing about canon law, that, as you say, people might come to it thinking this is obscure and irrelevant, but it really is relevant. It is applied theology, applied ecclesiology. You know, it's where the rubber hits the road, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think not starting from the beginning, I think, was my thing. I mean, we give them a sort of sheet of, these are all the canon headings, and we highlight the ones that we think are going to be important for now and important for the first year of cures. But we then choose, well, I then choose a couple of those. So it's, rather than quantity, it's quality, I think.
Sure. And I suppose my last question is, I'm conscious there must be such competition for time and for people's attention in a theological setting, in IME2, you know, every area of the church's life. We're bombarded by emails, and there must be real pressure on the timetable and people wanting to say, let's push this aside, someone else can deal with it. I mean, from what you're saying, sounds like you think it is worthwhile use of time, however hard it is. Is that right? Finding the time to address some of this as early as possible.
Because it has such connections with just about everything else that you are learning. So, you know, the ideas about baptism and baptism prep and so forth. They're doing stuff on ritual and pastoral care, but this matters. And interestingly, because at Queen's we're alongside Methodists as well, so looking at how we differ and where we agree is really interesting. And so often, you know, Anglicans will talk here about, oh, well, you know, we just have an open table for communion. And then asking about what that is and what does that look like in relation to canons. So I think almost every area of our life together as Church of England and in our ecumenical relationships, the canons have got feelers out into all of them. And it's not just about, how do I do this so I don't get told off? I think it's about, so what do I want to say about something that is both about me and bigger than me? I don't know if that's made sense. But.
It does. No, that's really, really interesting, Andrew. I think we could talk all day about this.
I'm so sorry, I really could.
Really, really interesting stuff. I thank you for
It's a pleasure.
For taking the time to talk. I mean, it's just, you know, our society is all about education and canon law, and you're actually obviously doing it there in the theological college setting. So it's been really great to talk to you today and to get a bit of an insight about what goes on.
And I think anybody who listens who's also in colleges and courses doing canon law, if they want to get in touch, it would be really good to have, I don't know, conversations together about the way that we're doing this and how we could pool some of our resources and thoughts, I think.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds like it would be a great initiative.
Great. Thank you, Russell.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.